Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. Psychiatry and religion have often been at odds on how to understand and describe religious experience and spirituality. For Freud, the sense of spiritual union with the universe, existence, reality, or God was a regression to the earliest stages of infantile experience. The adult was acting out childlike wishes as if he was still a baby not yet differentiated from his mother. Freud was essentially tone deaf to religious experience. Radical libertarian psychiatrist Thomas Szasz was a critic of institutional psychiatries increasing influence in aiding the secularization of religion's hold on humankind. As a legal term, he considered mental illness as no more a fact bearing on a suspect's guilt than those religious thinkers who believed he was possessed by the devil. As he famously put it, if you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia. If the dead talk to you, you're a spiritualist. And if you talk to the dead, you're again a schizophrenic. Zaz was as tone deaf as Freud. Our guests today on the Radical Imagination are not from that mold. Coming from their respective worlds of psychiatry and theology, their work has led to some remarkably similar conclusions. Psychiatrist James Gilligan believes that religious experience, properly understood and conceptualized, can represent a transcendence beyond the body and the mind. It can act as a progression to the most mature stage of human development, the spirit. It can help us achieve the most life-enhancing degree of mental and emotional health, the most fully developed capacity for love, basic trust, spiritual peace, the greatest joy and happiness in our relationships. And it can also lead to a much needed fusion coalition politics of caring and nurturing for all people around the world. Because today, millions around the world who feel threatened by the crisis of modernity that has destroyed their traditional sources of moral, legal, and political authority, their God, religion, and reason, are acting out their fears and confusions in ways incompatible with life and love. Fundamentalists who resort to terror and anarchy are perverting that religious experience of universal radical love. They regress to an immature, literal minded world based on dogma and blind faith, attracted to authoritarian leaders who promise absolute truth and certainty. Gilligan believes psychiatry needs to offer life preserving and life enhancing alternatives to this fundamentalism of nihilism and destruction. Theologian Serene Jones, like Jim, calls for a new and urgently necessary public theology that breaks through the surface of life, awakening us to the injustices of life and our conflicted human nature, trying to find meaning in a fractured world. She agrees with Jim that God can't be the old man in the sky with a white beard, hovering above us, watching and constantly judging us doing right and wrong. In that scenario, God becomes the authoritarian, ultimate patriarchal father figure. She believes we need a belief that the universe is ultimately loved by a divine reality that is greater and more wonderful than we can even begin to imagine. In this reality, we find our ultimate destiny and the purpose of our existence. God comes into us, even though we can't reach God. That's love. It's all we can say. We can only call it love. It's a reality beyond reality, yet one that's as close as the breath we breathe. For Serene, like Jim, love has the power to redeem if we can grasp that it exists within and yet comes from beyond desire, language, need, and want. That's the simple reason why she calls that love grace. We want to welcome Serene Jones to the Radical Imagination. She's the president of Union Theological Seminary in New York and is the first woman to head that 180-year-old institution. She occupies the Johnson Family Chair for Religion and Democracy and has been the past president of the American Academy of Religion. She's the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace, and most recently, Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. We also want to welcome James Gilligan to the show. Jim is clinical professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine and an adjunct professor in the School of Law at New York University. He's the author of several books, including Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, Preventing Violence, Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others, and the forthcoming Shame, Guilt, and Violence in Shakespeare. And interestingly, our guests are both children of the Midwest. Serene from the plains of Oklahoma and Jim from the plains of Nebraska. So welcome both of you. I'm so grateful and blessed to have you on the Radical Imagination. It's been a long time coming. I've wanted us to all meet, and here we are. And thank you again. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here for this conversation with Jim and Jim.
Jim and Jim.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on the pardon me, on the same program with Serene Jones, who is such a distinguished person.
Absolutely. And now, people might wonder why I'm, mention the fact that you're from the plains of Nebraska and Oklahoma, because in your books, Call It Grace, you say that in your introduction, Serene. Theology is a place in a story. Theology is a place in the story you think of when you ask yourself about the meaning of your life, of the world, and the possibility of God. For me, that place sits, windswept but defiant, on a plain in Oklahoma, a spot of red, dry earth in the middle of a farm, on the outskirts of the small town of Billings. It has a population of one, a spirit, mine, who has dwelled there as far back as my imagination reaches. I go there again and again to this dusty piece of land to remember what is true and to find God. Now, and Jim, you had also roots in the Badlands, and which you described as the immense unbroken Nebraska Dakota plain called for good reason the Badlands. No markers to orient people, no boundaries to limit their wandering, nothing visible but grass and sky. A land before for time and outside law, where a war of men and God was a constant battle. So how did those experiences influence your later life, your views on God and theology, and your work in psychiatry and then theology and so on? How did this set the tone for that prairie theology, if you will, as you call it, Serene?
Well, I can start. And for me, Jim, it all goes back to the whole theme of imagination. And I think our imaginations all work in various ways, but are profoundly marked by the space that we grow up in. And growing up in Oklahoma on the plains, where I could stand at my back door and see 20 miles in every direction, and which every mile is marked out by a dirt road or a paved road as mile lines, of plot lines where wheat is grown. That has so profoundly impacted the way I imagine the world around me and think about things, that I have, not only when it comes to thinking about God, but generally, I map things when I imagine. I put them in places on a flat surface with a huge sky above them and organize them into relationship with each other spatially, because my world was so spatially organized as this sort of flat map. So when it comes to imagining theologically, it makes sense that those plains, that flat, barren prairie, sometimes bearing wheat, becomes the terrain where the fodder for thinking about God is drawn. And I see huge open sky that stretches as far as the eye can see. And that for me is sort of a prerequisite for understanding this notion of grace and love, which is so expansive. It reaches beyond the horizons of what we're able to see and know, and yet is very present to us. Because that was a physical experience for me in that space.
Yeah. Jimmy, you're nodding your head. Is that what you also experienced?
Oh, tremendously. I spent the first 17 years of my life in the same place in Nebraska. And it certainly has influenced, just the space of it has influenced the rest of my life. And the type of space. It also influenced me because I was very aware how this was the homeland of the Indians, and that we, white invaders from basically originally European countries, really had invaded their space and deprived them of a lot of it. So from the time I was 5 or 6 years old, when they'd ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said an Indian. I just had not realized that was not possible. But I would say that the vastness of this space really enabled me to recover from a deep trauma that I had after I'd gone to college. In my third year of college, where I went back to Cambridge, Mass, to go to college. And when I was driving home for Christmas vacation in my junior year, this big semi-trailer truck ran directly head on into our car and killed 2 of my friends who were in the car, one of whom was really my best friend in college. And the driver of the car and I barely survived with concussions and broken bones and so forth. And I was still trying to recover from it emotionally 6 months later, when I decided that the way I could try to recover from this was to go out to Montana and work on a railroad crew, a bridge and building crew, swinging a sledgehammer and carrying 100-pound sacks of cement and so forth. So while I was out there, I was, I can read, well, no, I'll describe it. I don't need to read it. I was sitting on the top of the caboose, which was the dormitory for our railroad crew. And from one angle, I could see the plains of Montana, and at the other end of the horizon, the Rocky Mountains were rising up out of the plains. And when the sky got completely dark, I could see the endless array of the stars and planets and galaxies and nebulae. And it was just overwhelming. And then in the midst of this, I heard this kind of mysterious chant emanating across the plains, coming from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation that was right next door to us, where some anonymous person was worshiping the Great Spirit. And I suddenly realized the enormity of not just the universe, but of the very fact that anything existed, that we existed, that there was such a thing as life and consciousness, and what a miracle that was. Now, I have to say this happened quite soon after I received a totally unsolicited letter that I wasn't expecting from a very kind Episcopal priest, in whose church I had served as an altar boy or acolyte when I was 12 years old. And he remembered me and had read about our auto accident in the newspaper and wrote me a lovely letter of sympathy. And that so moved me because I felt I had not gotten kind of any sense that anybody really understood how lost I felt. And I think it was with that, as a inspiration, I was just open to the magnitude and the mystery of the universe, the infinity of it. It reminded me of Einstein's statement that science has proven that there's no such thing as a miracle, but actually everything is a miracle. And this experience changed my life forever. I felt like that was when I woke up. I finally became alive, fully alive and conscious and human. And I felt like, although I could not see the Great Spirit that the Indian was chanting about, actually was spread out in front of my eyes all through just the infinity of this world. And it was more than just the physical infinity. I realized even that was only, it was limited to what my eyes could take in. And clearly, I still, the ultimate reality was still invisible to me. So I was left with a sense of awe and wonder and humility, the recognition of how insignificant not only I was, but all of us compared with this, infinite, immense, unknowable source of reality that none of us could understand, but that it was a totally gratuitous gift, the gift of life, the gift of existence, the gift of reality. And I would say that has influenced my life ever since. I've totally decided not to be bothered by the everyday quotidian worries and anxieties that we all can get so wrapped up in that we only see 2 inches in front of our face. I've always lived in that world of this endless eternity, for which terms like God and religion are really embarrassingly inadequate to describe. It's beyond anything that we can formulate. But that was really, it was a direct response to that world, and it has influenced me the rest of my life.
Mhm. And Serene, you've had various traumas which you write about in the book as well. How do you relate to what Jim just has said?
Oh, I can relate to every part of it. The immensity, the how one in that environment is struck in particular. This is still very foundational to my own perception of myself in the world. When you stand under that sky, you realize that your own life is just one small, insignificant point in that vastness. And it has a way of displacing you from the center of the world and putting you in the right place, which is in your smallness, you find a sort of freedom. You aren't the center of the universe. The universe is so much bigger, and it emphasizes to you the fact that you could very well not be here, and yet you are, which I think is the beginning of religious consciousness.
Yes.
Is a moment where you realize that for some miraculous reason, you are here and you could not be. And one day you will not be. But you're here in every moment. It's a miracle. And that landscape impresses that upon you. In terms of my own family story, my great-grandparents were Sooners. They were dirt poor, came on the land run, and settled in Billings. That passage you read, Jim, describes that sod house they built when they first came to Oklahoma. The other part of my family came from Tennessee as sharecroppers, and then on the Trail of Tears is my Cherokee background. And with those three combined, I think another piece of my experience of what it meant to be on those plains was that life is it's hard, and it's not meant to be easy. The fact that life is messy and we encounter struggles, as my great grandparents had to dig a house out of concrete hard dirt even to find a place to live, that's not something unusual, but that is like the nature of life. And within that sort of rugged, gritty messiness, we find the power of love and the power of our relationships that sustains us. So you get this kind of tensive sense that the hardships of life and the struggle and the beauty of life and the love that it creates sort of sit there all tangled up together as what is. And that is what it means to exist, is to be all caught up in that tangle of reality.
As you go on with your studies, both of you become more committed to the social, if you will, the political, correct? You know, how does that fit into your own personal theology? And how did that play itself out in your professional careers? Because
Well,
Jim,
I could comment that, you know, I started with an awareness of how mistreated Native Americans had been. When I would go as a child to Western movies, I would cheer for the Indians, not the cowboys. And my friends would ask why. And I would say, look what we learned in Sunday school. You're taught not to steal. Well, what did we do except steal people's land? I could go to the small farm that my father owned right outside of the small town we lived in. And under a tree, I would discover Indian arrowheads, which reminded me how recently they had lived there. I'm like a generation or two ago. And we were living on their land, and we had stolen it. I also was aware, my father was a doctor, and I was aware that in this small town, that was a status hierarchy. And some of my best friends, people who schoolmates that I loved, really came from much sort of more, well, in that community, less exalted backgrounds. And I realized how unfair that was. It just made me feel bad. I think I just carried that with me. It started right there. It was, you know, you couldn't help but see it. And so that has affected me all my life. That I'm reminded of something that, Serene, you referred to Gustavo Gutierrez in your book, the Call It Grace, who was a liberation theologian. And that really influenced me. He reminded me also of something that Gandhi said once, which was that the deadliest form of violence is poverty. I've written a lot about what's called structural violence, meaning the increased death rates of the poor compared to the rich, where the social structure divides the population into the rich and the poor. So I think this is just unavoidable. So I spent my life as a psychiatrist working with the people who are most outcast and most rejected by our society, namely people who've been convicted of violent crimes. And my sense is there is no more outcast group you could possibly find in our society. They're hated, they're reviled. People just want to punish them and either kill them or put them in prison and throw away the key, which of course only perpetuates the problem. I mean, it doesn't do anything toward helping people and helping our whole society to become less violent. So I've devoted my life to working with these people, almost all of whom pardon me, come from backgrounds of poverty, lack of education, many are illiterate, homelessness, members of minority groups that are treated with disdain as inferior, and on and on. So my sense is it's time for us to really pay maximal attention to the people at the bottom of our societies. It's intolerable that we would tolerate this kind of thing. Other countries have done so much better than we have, and it's just inexcusable that we've treated our population the way we have.
Yeah, that's first of all, the commitment you've made to this life work is so important and so inspiring. You know, for me, I had the privilege and I wish more people had this privilege, but I grew up in a religious family that was also very progressive. And the Christian denomination that I was part of, the Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church, was as a whole denomination, started by basically as a westward movement religion. So it was very local, very universalist, very down to earth. And I don't remember ever not thinking that in my upbringing, to be a Christian meant to follow Jesus. And where did Jesus go? Well, Jesus threw in the lot with the downtrodden, outcast, the marginal, prisoner, the poor. And that was just in the fundamental story that I learned from the time that I could take in the world around me. And it's so fundamental to me. I can't imagine. It is so interesting to hear people's sort of coming to awareness stories, and how different that is from someone who grows up with that as a given. But that doesn't mean that I, growing up, had the full understanding. I still don't, of what the work of social justice involves. And my life has been one long journey of peeling back more and more layers of my own perception and my own freedom to act against oppression. And that took me to finally to seminary and to graduate school, and landed me here now 13 years at Union Theological Seminary, which of all the seminaries in the world is the one that is most known for being thoroughly grounded in fact, saturated in social justice. So, in being the president of Union, I sort of met the person that I was destined to be from the start, in where faith and scholarship come together to reimagine the work of justice. That's one of our brand statements about ourselves. So I find myself it's incapable of distinguishing my own faith commitments from my commitments to social justice. If you're not concerned about the injustices of our world and committing your life to making the world better, then you can't claim to be a Christian. I'm describing the sort of world in which my own social criticism evolved. Now, of course, I learned along the way a lot of horrible things that I wasn't taught as a child about Christianity. And I also learned to see the limits of the kind of white liberal Christianity that I was raised in, that thought it understood what social justice was, and sort of approached it from a safe distance. And as I've grown and matured, I've learned much more about the legacy of white supremacy and how that cuts into all of our psyches, but it cut a deep slash through that Oklahoma upbringing. And that's all part of the uncovering this relationship between faith and social justice.
And that Oklahoma upbringing also included, and you speak about in your book, of course, that relationship with Freddie, right? Friend of yours as you were growing up, your own grandfather, and some of the repressive, regressive positions he took, and that experience with Timothy McVeigh and that horrible situation. That also really helped expand, you dented in dealing with that trauma and that particular horrible, violent event that I'm sure Jim can speak to as well. But how did and your trip to India was quite eventful, to put it mildly, in terms of your consciousness raising, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, thank you for reminding me. I wrote the book on grace and realized at the end that every chapter was a theological exploration of a different trauma that had provoked an enormous conflict and change in my life. But to come back to one that everyone is familiar with, is the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh. It's always struck me when it comes to the way in which words about terrorism get thrown around today, that my first experience with terrorism was from a white boy who looked like he had come from the military. And my family was dramatically impacted by the bombing. My then brother-in-law was injured in it. I lost friends. But in the book, I talk about for the first time having to grapple with the magnitude of evil in the world. This was pre 9/11, and it was, since Pearl Harbor, the most violent act that had happened on American soil. And I also had to reckon with my own anger about it. And my desire, here I was, a peace-loving activist. I had done, decades of work against the death penalty. I'm just using that as one example of a social justice issue. And here, all I could think about was how Timothy McVeigh, deserved to die and be, just like Jim, you're describing people who have committed horrendous acts. He needed to be killed and thrown away. And in my own struggles with that, I had to come to grips with the kind of devastating hold that hatred can have on your capacity to love, and that I wasn't doing anything harmful to Timothy McVeigh, but that hatred and violence was actually destroying me. And it was a spiritual journey for me to let go of it and understand forgiveness in a way that's deeper than not saying, oh, I forgive you, it's okay, it wasn't really that bad. I mean, the Oklahoma City bombing is not something one forgives in a trite way, but forgiveness in this very large sense of letting go of the hold that the violence or the harm or the trauma has upon you, to sort of release those tentacles and to learn to experience the freedom of connection to others as those tentacles of violence release themselves. And it's a very difficult process, but unless one sort of is willing to go down that hole of violence in our whole culture and reckon with how it lives inside of us and what we do with it, it's very hard to have an open heart and to really be present for the work of justice in the world.
Jim, how does that play out in your work as a psychiatrist, therapeutically? How does that dynamic work in terms of forgiveness, redemption, consciousness raising? You've worked with so many of these sorts of violent people.
Well, again, I'd have to say, although I don't belong to any organized religion as such, a particular church. As a child, I was raised as an Episcopalian, but then sent to a Roman Catholic convent boarding school. So I went to a Catholic mass every day there. So I was raised, and a lot of my family were Catholic. So I was really raised as both a Protestant and a Catholic. So I wound up being also a Buddhist and various other things. But I really, I would say I was very influenced by one religious comment that I used to think of was kind of a cliche. And then I realized how profoundly true it was. And that was Wesley's comment when he saw a prisoner, in handcuffs going underneath his window and said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." The moment I got into the prisons, I was stunned by hearing of a degree of child abuse that I had never even realized existed in our society. The most violent among the prisoners were people who were the survivors of their own attempted murders, often at the hands of a parent, or of the actual murders of a close family member, a sibling or a parent. And I realized that these victimizers had learned to be victimizers by becoming victims themselves first. And there's a tremendous overlap between a history of being violently abused and committing violence against others as an adult. So but again, my religious upbringing in ways that I didn't even realize until years or decades later influenced this. I recently came across a verse from the Bible that I hadn't even remembered, but where Jesus said, it's only the sick who need physicians. I come not to call the righteous, but sinners. And it struck me, I spent my life working with the sinners, but it hadn't occurred to me how much that was influenced by things I was taught as a 5-year-old. And so I can't, the other thing I'd say is, I've really spent a lot of my career in rebellion against Freud's put downs of what Romain Rolland called the oceanic feeling, by which Rolland meant to refer to religious experience. And Freud said that was simply this is the sense of oneness with the universe and with God. And Freud said that was simply a regression of the earliest stage of infancy before the child has learned to differentiate between people and self. I would say the opposite. I think that the oceanic feeling of what I described earlier of my own experience in Montana is really the highest level of consciousness. It's something that many people may not ever reach in their life. So I feel I was sleepwalking until I discovered that. And what that led me to decide was to develop really an enlarged theory of personality. Conventional psychology thinks of human beings as soma and psyche, body and mind or soul. I think I go with St. Paul, who said in his first letter to the Thessalonians, he spoke of body, soul, and spirit, soma, psyche, and pneuma. And I think we underestimate the human potential if we think of people as being only soma and psyche. I think that pneuma is something everybody has the potential for, and that we all would have if we weren't traumatized or deprived in our life experiences. But I think we do need an enlarged understanding of the human personality if we're going to do justice to the human potential.
Yeah, and just to come back to one thing you said that's so interesting, and that is a big theme in my book, and that is, which I also find a liberating theme, and that is the spiritual belief that that human beings are fundamentally, wondrous beings, but also profoundly broken. And in the Christian language, that's called, we're both saints and we're sinners. And reckoning with the sin in the world and not trying to sugarcoat it or, pretend like it's not there, but having it at the core of your understanding of what it means to be human beings is very freeing, because you don't have to make people either all good or all bad. And it really requires, and I remember this from my childhood, being taught that, there but for the grace of God go I, or that the most, those that you perceive as being most horrendous among us, you are yet 1 inch away from them, had you suffered what they suffer. And I think that in our society and in general, we've lost the ability to talk about that sort of shared brokenness. I mean, have the language. We've gotten allergic to notions of sin, and it's quite important when it comes to the work of social justice to see how pervasive our brokenness is from the social systems and family systems we grow up in, and what that does to break our spirits, and how we're all affected by it.
And
I totally agree. Well, one of the insights that enabled me to tolerate working with men, and they were all men, who had committed really unimaginable cruelty and atrocity on other people. And one thing that enabled me to still see their humanity was a statement from a book on the Christian view of I think it was of politics. But in any case, the concept was that speaking of human beings, none are good, but all are sacred. And what struck me is, yeah, none of us are good. We are all sinners. I mean, whether or not you believe in original sin as it's conceptualized, the point is all of us do things that are, really inexcusable. We hurt the people we love the most. And that's part of being human. And yet, even the worst offenders have a soul that I think we have to treat as sacred. Because once we stop treating every human being as sacred, we open the door to unimaginable violence and cruelty on our own part. What I'm struck by is the worst violence in history, both whether it's interpersonal violence or collective political violence or religious violence, is always committed in the name of morality and religion. And we have to realize that people, I see the worst sinners in the world, if you want to call them that. None of them feel, well, maybe 1 out of 100 or 1,000 feel guilty for what they did. They feel they were perfectly justified. They were acting according to their sense of justice, and they're not kidding. They will go to their own death to stand up for what they feel is just and fair. The only difference between them and the rest of us is they feel they are the victims of injustice, which in some ways they are, rather than the committers of injustice. So, I mean, if we're going to understand violence and how to stop it, I think we have to be able to recognize that everybody is capable of horrendous behavior if the circumstances are set up right for them to do that. And secondly, we need to understand that if we want to learn how to prevent or at least reduce the frequency and intensity of violence in our society.
Absolutely. And collectively, as we look around the world, more and more of these people are turning to authoritarian regimes. And so both of you and your work is so crucial at this point to get us to understand that we do have other options. And it is about mercy and forgiveness. Although, Serene, you make a distinction there, right? Between forgiveness and mercy.
Yes. Yes, I mean, forgiveness is something that I describe as just one example, as I did today, what I had to do in relation to Timothy McVeigh to let go of the hold that violence had on my being. And that becoming a forgiving society would also be one that did not kill people, as to represent what goodness looks like. But mercy is entirely different, because mercy is the forgiveness, the love, the embrace of the divine, however you want to think about that. That comes even when one cannot get to that point where you can let go of the violence. It's the knowledge that the truth of divine love is the fundamental truth of all creatures and of all of this planet. And therefore, that which may seem unforgivable to me in mercy, in the mercy of God, is held by God in love, which is also a very freeing understanding of divine love. That sometimes there's just limits to what we're capable of. But if we're able to imagine that in God, that love is poured out, it changes the way you view the world.
And just in the few seconds we have left, so that's what you're meaning when you say call it grace, and correct? And Jim, is there a way to describe that same feeling in psychiatry, the therapeutic process? How would you use it? You talk a lot about humiliation and disrespect and so on.
Well, I think grace is related to concepts like gift and gratitude. And I think that when people are able to develop fully, to mature sufficiently, they become aware of what a gift life and existence are that we don't ordinarily, we take for granted. We don't wake up to how lucky we are and how much we have to give thanks for. And I would say that, well, how can I put it? Grace is the opposite of narcissism. I mean, it's when people realize how lucky they are rather than thinking how deprived they are. And often people are deprived, but the point is, one thing we learned in the prisons is that the punishment doesn't stop people from being violent. It only stimulates more violence. It's the most powerful stimulant of violence we've ever discovered. What enables people to stop being violent is when we give them something that people might call a gift, but by that I mean giving them access to non-violent resources for building up their sense of self-worth as a human being so that they can emotionally afford to recognize the worth in other people. I mean, if anything stimulates what we call narcissistic entitlement, the sense that the world owes me everything, what causes that is deprivation. The more somebody's deprived, the more they feel they deserve anything they want.
And Jim, unfortunately, we're over time, but you finished on an incredible note. We need to have our president see you in therapy, and he needs grace, and we all do. Thank you so very much. This has been great. I wish we had so much more time. I hope we can do this again. Thank you both so very, very much for being on the Radical Imagination.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Take care. And thank you so very, very much for watching us this week on the Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week. And call it grace. Love. Take care, everybody. Bye.
It all began when they took me from my home and put me on death row. A crime for which I'm totally innocent, you know. I began to warm and chill to objects and their feels. A ragged cup, a twisted mop, the face of Jesus in my soup. Those sinister dinner deals, the meal trolley's wicked wheels, a hook bone rising from my food, and all things either good or ungood. And the mercy seat is waiting, and I think my head is burning, and in a way I'm yearning to be done with all this weighing of the truth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and anyway I told the truth, and I'm not afraid to die. I hear stories from the chamber. Christ was born into a manger, and like some ragged stranger, he died upon the cross. Might I say it seems so fitting, in its way he was a carpenter by trade, or at least that's what I'm told. My killed hands tattooed evil across its brother's fist. That filthy fire, they did nothing to challenge or resist. In heaven his throne is made of gold, the ark of his testament is stowed, a throne from which I'm told all history does unfold. It's made of wood and wire, and my body is on fire, and God is never far away. Into the mercy seat I climb, my head is shaved, my head is wired, and like a moth that tries to enter the bright eye, I go shuffling out of life just to hide in death a while. And anyway, I never lie, and the mercy seat is waiting, and I think my head is burning, and in a way I'm yearning to be done with all this weighing of the truth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and anyway I told the truth, and I'm not afraid to die. And the mercy seat is burning, hoping to be done with all this twisting of the truth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And anyway, there was no proof. And I'm not afraid to die. And the mercy seat is glowing, and I think my head is smoking. And in a way I'm hoping to be done with all these looks of disbelief. A life for a life and a truth for a truth. And I've got nothing left to lose. And I'm not afraid to die. And the mercy seat is smoking, and I think my head is melting. And in a way that's helping to be done with all this twisting of the truth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And anyway, I told the truth, but I'm afraid I told a lie.